The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Marcus Blackwell's corner office on the 47th floor, each droplet exploding like tiny bombs against the glass that separated him from the chaos of Manhattan below. The city stretched endlessly beneath him, a tapestry of ambition and desperation woven together by steel and concrete, but tonight it felt more like a prison than an empire. The mahogany desk before him bore the weight of contracts worth billions, yet Marcus found himself staring at a single photograph, a silver-framed image of his wife Isabella at their wedding 5 years ago, her emerald eyes sparkling with what he'd believed was genuine love. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you're enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Thunder rolled across the skyline as Marcus's fingers traced the edge of the frame, his wedding ring catching the harsh fluorescent light. At 42, he had built Blackwell Industries from nothing, transforming a small tech startup into a global powerhouse that employed over 50,000 people across 6 continents. His net worth exceeded $8 billion. His influence reached into every corner of the business world, and his name graced the covers of Fortune and Forbes with monotonous regularity. Yet tonight, sitting alone in his office at nearly midnight, he felt more isolated than he had as a homeless teenager sleeping in subway stations 25 years ago. The elevator chimed softly behind him, and Marcus didn't need to turn around to know it was his assistant, Elena Rodriguez. She had been with him for 12 years, through 3 major acquisitions, 2 hostile takeover attempts, and countless sleepless nights when the weight of his empire threatened to crush him. At 38, Elena possessed an efficiency that bordered on prescience, anticipating his needs before he voiced them, managing his calendar with surgical precision, and maintaining the delicate balance between his public persona and private struggles. The Meridian deal closed successfully, Elena said, her voice carrying its usual note of professional satisfaction. The board voted unanimously, and the stock price is already responding favorably in after-hours trading. You should be celebrating, Marcus. Marcus finally turned from the window, his steel-gray eyes meeting Elena's concerned brown ones. He asked, "Is he?" voice carrying a weariness that no amount of money could cure. Another acquisition, another few $100 million in revenue, another 1,000 employees whose lives now depend on decisions I make in rooms they'll never see. When does it end, Elena? Elena approached his desk, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor. She wore her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, her navy business suit impeccable despite the late hour. She said, "It ends when you decide it ends, but that's not really what's bothering you tonight, is it?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the wedding photograph again. "Isabella's been distant lately," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "More than distant. It's like she's physically present, but emotionally somewhere else entirely. When I try to talk to her about it, she deflects, changes the subject, or suddenly remembers an appointment with her personal trainer or yoga instructor or whatever new hobby has captured her attention this week." Elena's expression softened with understanding. She had watched Marcus's marriage evolve over the years, had seen the initial passion gradually give way to polite coexistence, had witnessed Isabella's transformation from an ambitious art curator to what some might charitably call a socialite. "Have you considered that maybe she's struggling with the isolation too?" Elena asked gently. "Being married to someone like you isn't easy. The constant scrutiny, the security measures, the way people treat her differently because of who you are. It changes a person." Marcus stood and walked to the window again, pressing his palm against the cool glass. The city's lights blurred through the rain, creating abstract patterns that reminded him of Isabella's paintings from their early days together. She had been so passionate then, so full of fire and creativity. Her art was raw and honest, reflecting a depth of emotion that had drawn him to her like a moth to flame. Now her canvases remained blank, gathering dust in the converted studio he'd built for her in their Hamptons estate.
"I gave her everything," Marcus said, his breath fogging the glass. "The penthouse overlooking Central Park, the house in the Hamptons, the villa in Tuscany. I bought her the gallery she always dreamed of owning. Introduced her to collectors who could launch her career into the stratosphere. I thought if I could give her the world, she'd be happy. I thought she'd love me the way I loved her." Elena rose from her chair and joined him at the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass beside his. "Money can't buy happiness, Marcus. You of all people should know that. You've spent most of your adult life proving that wealth doesn't fill the emptiness inside." The observation struck him like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. Marcus had climbed from poverty to unimaginable wealth, had conquered every business challenge placed before him, had achieved success beyond his wildest childhood dreams. Yet the hunger remained, the constant need to prove himself, to build something bigger, to matter in a world that had once discarded him like garbage. His phone buzzed against the desk, and Marcus glanced at the screen to see a text message from Isabella. "Don't wait up. Having dinner with the girls. We'll be late." The message was sent at 11:47 p.m., long past any reasonable dinner hour, and it was the third time this week she'd used the same excuse. The girls, a rotating cast of wealthy wives whose primary occupations seemed to involve charity galas, shopping expeditions, and lengthy lunches at exclusive restaurants, had become Isabella's primary social circle since their marriage. "She's lying," Marcus said quietly, showing Elena the message. "This is the third time this week she's claimed to be out with friends, but when I mentioned it to Patricia Williamson at the art auction last month, she seemed confused, said Isabella hadn't joined them for dinner in months." Elena studied the message, her expression carefully neutral. "Maybe she's meeting with new friends," she suggested, though her tone lacked conviction. "Or perhaps she's pursuing a project she wants to keep private until it's ready. You know how secretive artists can be about their work." Marcus wanted to believe Elena's gentle explanations, wanted to accept the possibility that his wife was simply rediscovering her creative passion or expanding her social circle. But 13 years of building a business empire had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct he possessed was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with his marriage. The signs had been accumulating for months, hushed phone conversations that ended abruptly when he entered the room, unexplained absences that grew longer and more frequent, a newfound interest in her appearance that manifested in expensive shopping trips and regular appointments with personal trainers and stylists. The thunder grew louder, and lightning illuminated the office in stark flashes that made the shadows dance across the walls. Marcus thought about his driver, James, who had worked for the family for 3 years. A former military man with an instinct for discretion, James had mentioned seeing Isabella getting into unfamiliar cars on several occasions, always offering to drive her instead, always being politely declined. There was also Maria, their housekeeper of 4 years, whose usually warm demeanor had grown distant and uncomfortable whenever Isabella's activities came up in conversation. "Elena," Marcus said slowly, "if you suspected something was wrong, if you thought someone you cared about was being betrayed, what would you do?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, her reflection in the window appearing troubled. "I would want to know the truth," she said finally, "but I would also be prepared for the possibility that the truth might be more complicated and painful than I expected. Sometimes the people we love make choices we don't understand, choices that have nothing to do with us and everything to do with their own struggles and fears." Marcus nodded, though her words offered little comfort. He thought about the early days of his relationship with Isabella, when they would spend hours talking about art, philosophy, and their dreams for the future. She had challenged him intellectually, had pushed him to see beyond the narrow focus of business success, had made him feel like more than just the sum of his bank accounts. Their physical connection had been electric, passionate in a way that left him breathless and vulnerable. She had seen past his wealth to the broken boy underneath, had kissed his scars and traced the tattoo on his shoulder. A small phoenix he'd gotten after his first major business success, a symbol of rising from the ashes of his impoverished youth. Now that intimacy felt like a distant memory. Isabella's kisses had grown perfunctory, their conversations reduced to logistics about social calendars and household management. They slept in the same bed, but on opposite sides, an invisible wall of silence stretching between them. Marcus had tried to bridge that gap countless times, had planned romantic getaways and surprise dinners, had bought her jewelry and art pieces he thought she'd love. But each gesture seemed to drive her further away, as if his efforts to reconnect were somehow offensive or unwelcome. The rain intensified, and Marcus watched a lone taxi navigate the flooded streets below. Inside that cab, he imagined, were people with their own secrets, their own betrayals, their own desperate attempts to make sense of love and loss in a city that devoured dreams as quickly as it created them. The thought brought him little comfort, but it reminded him that his pain was not unique, that wealth and power offered no immunity from the fundamental human experience of heartbreak. Elena checked her watch and gathered her files from the desk. "I should let you get home," she said. "Isabella will be wondering where you are." "No," Marcus said, his voice hollow with resignation. "She won't. She stopped wondering about me a long time ago." As Elena prepared to leave, Marcus found himself wondering what tomorrow would bring. Would Isabella's lies become more elaborate? Would he continue to pretend not to notice? Would they maintain this facade of marriage until it crumbled entirely? Or would he find the courage to confront the growing chasm between them? The elevator closed behind Elena with a soft whisper, leaving Marcus alone with the storm and his suspicions. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Millions of people navigating their own complicated relationships, their own moments of doubt and discovery. Somewhere out there, his wife was living a secret life that didn't include him, making choices that would ultimately determine the fate of everything they had built together. Marcus picked up the wedding photograph again, studying Isabella's face for clues he might have missed, signs that might have predicted this moment of doubt and despair. Her smile in the photo was radiant, genuine, full of hope for their shared future. Had that happiness been real, or had he simply seen what he wanted to see? Had their love been authentic, or had he unknowingly bought himself a beautiful lie, wrapped in a wedding dress? The penthouse was silent when Marcus finally arrived home at 2:30 a.m., the kind of oppressive quiet that seemed to amplify every small sound, the soft hum of the climate control system, the distant murmur of traffic 40 floors below, the almost inaudible tick of the antique grandfather clock Isabella had insisted they buy from a Parisian auction house. The marble foyer gleamed under the soft illumination of crystal sconces, reflecting his solitary figure as he loosened his tie and removed his Italian leather shoes, a nightly ritual that had once felt like coming home, but now felt like entering a mausoleum of failed dreams. Isabella's Hermes handbag sat abandoned on the console table, its contents spilling slightly. Lipstick, car keys, a phone charger, and what appeared to be a restaurant receipt crumpled into a small ball. Marcus paused, his hand hovering over the receipt, knowing that examining it would cross a line he'd never crossed before. Trust, once broken, could never be fully repaired. But suspicion, once unleashed, consumed everything in its path like wildfire.
He left the receipt untouched and climbed the floating staircase to their bedroom, each step echoing through the cavernous space. The master suite sprawled across nearly 1,000 square feet, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Central Park. Isabella lay curled on her side of their California king bed, her auburn hair spread across the silk pillowcase like spilled wine. Even in sleep, she was breathtaking. High cheekbones that belonged in a Renaissance painting, full lips that had once whispered promises of forever, and skin that still glowed with the kind of natural beauty that no amount of money could buy or time could completely diminish. She wore a black silk nightgown he didn't recognize, something new and expensive that clung to her curves in ways that stirred memories of better times. Marcus undressed quietly in the walk-in closet, hanging his suit with the mechanical precision of someone whose life had become a series of automated routines. The mirror reflected a man who looked older than his 42 years, silver threading through his dark hair, lines of stress etched around his gray eyes, the slight stoop of shoulders that carried too much weight. He had once been lean from hunger, then muscular from manual labor, and now he maintained his physique through expensive personal trainers and private gyms, another purchased solution to a problem that went deeper than physical appearance. Sleep eluded him as he lay beside Isabella, acutely aware of the distance between their bodies despite sharing the same bed. Her breathing was deep and steady, but occasionally she would murmur something unintelligible, and Marcus found himself straining to hear, wondering if she spoke another man's name in her dreams. The thought was toxic, poisonous, but he couldn't banish it from his mind. How long had it been since she'd reached for him in her sleep? How long since they'd awakened, tangled together, her head on his chest, her fingers tracing lazy patterns on his skin? The alarm sounded at 5:30 a.m., as it had every weekday for the past 12 years. Marcus's routine was sacred, carved from the discipline that had lifted him from poverty to power. 20 minutes of meditation, 40 minutes in the private gym, a cold shower that shocked his system into full alertness, then coffee and financial reports while the city slowly awakened below. This morning routine was his anchor, the foundation upon which each day was built. But today it felt hollow, performed without purpose or joy. Isabella remained asleep as he moved through his ritual, her body perfectly still beneath the covers. There had been a time when she would join him for morning coffee, when they would plan their days together, share observations about the world outside their windows, discuss business challenges and artistic inspirations with equal enthusiasm. Those conversations had been among his favorite moments, intimate exchanges that made the vast penthouse feel like home rather than just an expensive address. By 7 a.m., Marcus was dressed in his daily uniform, a charcoal Tom Ford suit, French cuffs fastened with platinum cufflinks that had been his first major purchase after his company went public, shoes polished to a mirror shine. The man in the bathroom mirror looked successful, composed, ready to conquer another day of corporate warfare. But behind his eyes, Marcus saw something different. The hollow gaze of someone who was beginning to realize that all his achievements meant nothing if the person he loved most had stopped loving him in return. James was waiting in the lobby with the Bentley, his military posture and pressed uniform as impeccable as always. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwell," he said, opening the rear door. "Traffic is light this morning. We should reach the office ahead of schedule." Marcus settled into the leather seat and pulled out his phone, scrolling through the overnight reports from his international offices. The Tokyo division had secured a major contract with an automotive manufacturer. The London office had successfully navigated a regulatory challenge that could have cost millions. The Sao Paulo team had identified a promising acquisition target. His empire was growing, thriving, generating wealth at a pace that would have been unimaginable to the teenage boy who once stole food to survive. Yet, as the Bentley glided through Manhattan's awakening streets, Marcus found his attention drifting from quarterly projections to the couples walking together on the sidewalks below. A young man in a rumpled suit held hands with a woman in scrubs, probably a doctor or nurse heading home from a night shift. An older couple shared a newspaper at a coffee shop window, their gray heads bent together over the headlines. Simple moments of connection that Marcus suddenly envied with an intensity that surprised him. His phone buzzed with a text from Isabella. "Don't wait up tonight. Gallery opening in Soho. We'll probably run late." Another excuse, another evening alone, another lie wrapped in the
sophisticated language of her social calendar. Marcus stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. He could respond with questions, demands for specifics, expressions of disappointment. Instead, he typed back, "Have fun. Love you." The words felt like stones in his mouth, heavy and bitter. How long had he been saying, "I love you," to someone who no longer loved him back? How long had he been living in the ghost of a marriage, going through the motions while the substance slowly evaporated? Elena was waiting with coffee and the day's schedule when he arrived at the office. Her dark eyes studied his face with concern, but she said nothing about his haggard appearance. "The Morrison meeting has been moved to 11, she reported. "Your lunch with the Deutsche Bank representatives is confirmed for 1:30. And your wife called to remind you about the charity auction tomorrow night." "Did she?" Marcus asked, surprised. Isabella hadn't mentioned the auction, and they typically attended such events together. It was part of their public persona, the power couple, the billionaire and his beautiful wife, supporting worthy causes while networking with New York's elite. She seemed, Elena paused, choosing her words carefully, distracted. She asked me to confirm your attendance, but didn't say whether she'd be joining you. Marcus nodded, filing the information away with all the other small betrayals and casual neglects that had accumulated over the months. Each incident was minor by itself, but together they formed a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. He remembered reading once that marriages didn't die from dramatic explosions, but from slow erosions, tiny cuts that eventually proved fatal. The morning passed in a blur of meetings and decisions, the familiar rhythm of corporate leadership providing temporary refuge from personal turmoil. Marcus found himself more aggressive in negotiations, more demanding with his staff, as if professional dominance could compensate for domestic impotence. By lunch, he realized that he was becoming the kind of executive he'd once despised, cold, imperious, treating people as resources rather than human beings. The restaurant where he met the Deutsche Bank team was one of Isabella's favorites, a small Italian place in Midtown where they'd celebrated their second anniversary. Marcus found himself scanning the room, wondering if she'd ever brought someone else here, if their special places had been contaminated by her secrets. The German executives discussed loan terms and investment opportunities, but Marcus heard their words through a fog of distraction. His responses automatic and professional, while his mind wandered to darker possibilities. After lunch, walking back to his office, Marcus impulsively detoured through Central Park. The afternoon sun filtered through autumn leaves, creating patterns of light and shadow on the paths where Isabella and he used to walk together. She had loved the park in fall, had insisted on coming here every weekend during their first year of marriage. They would walk for hours, talking about everything and nothing, her hand in his, her laughter carrying on the breeze like music. Now the park felt like a graveyard of memories, each bench and pathway holding echoes of happier times. Marcus sat on their old favorite spot overlooking the reservoir, watching joggers and families enjoying the crisp October air. A couple roughly his and Isabella's age walked past, the woman's head resting on the man's shoulder, their conversation animated and warm. Marcus felt a sharp pang of envy, followed by a wave of self-pity that disgusted him. He was Marcus Blackwell, master of his own destiny, conqueror of impossible challenges. He had built an empire from nothing, had survived betrayals and setbacks that would have destroyed weaker men.
Yet here he sat, paralyzed by the possibility that his wife might be unfaithful, afraid to confront the truth that could shatter the carefully constructed life he'd built around their marriage. His phone rang, jarring him from his brooding. Elena's voice was crisp and efficient. "The Seoul office needs your approval on the semiconductor deal. Can you take the call?" Marcus walked back to the office, his mind returning reluctantly to the business of making money. But even as he negotiated millions in international trade agreements, part of him remained in the park, wondering when he had become a man who envied strangers for the simple act of holding hands.
That evening, the penthouse was empty again. Isabella's note, written in her elegant handwriting, was propped against a vase of white orchids. At the gallery opening, "Don't wait up, I." Even her signature had become abbreviated, a single letter instead of her full name, as if she couldn't spare the time for complete intimacy, even in a brief note. Marcus poured himself a scotch and stood at the living room windows, watching the city lights begin to twinkle in the gathering darkness. Somewhere out there, Isabella was living her secret life, moving through rooms he'd never seen, talking to people he'd never met, perhaps touching someone else the way she once touched him. The thought was a knife twisting in his chest, but he couldn't stop imagining scenarios that grew more painful with each repetition. His reflection in the window showed a man who had everything and nothing, wealth beyond measure, power that spanned continents, and a hollow space where his heart used to be. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove his worth in the only arena where he'd ever felt truly competent. But tonight, alone in his palace in the sky, Marcus Blackwell was just another man wondering if the person he loved had stopped loving him back. The charity auction at the Metropolitan Museum was the kind of event that defined New York's social hierarchy, a glittering assemblage of old money and new power, where seven-figure donations were made with casual elegance and every conversation carried the weight of potential business deals or social advancement. Marcus arrived alone, his absence of a companion noted immediately by the society photographers who positioned themselves strategically throughout the museum's Great Hall. Their camera flashes created artificial lightning against the classical architecture, capturing moments of manufactured intimacy for tomorrow's gossip columns. Isabella had left another note, this one even briefer than usual. "Migraine. Can't make it tonight. Sorry. I." The word sorry felt particularly hollow, a social nicety rather than genuine regret. Marcus had stood in their bedroom holding the note and listening to the shower running, knowing she was behind that frosted glass door preparing for an evening that didn't include him. He could have knocked, could have insisted they discuss her sudden illness, could have demanded the truth. Instead, he had folded the note carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket, another piece of evidence in a case he was building against his own wife. Elena appeared at his elbow, resplendent in midnight blue silk that complemented her natural elegance. As his assistant, she often accompanied him to events where spousal presence was expected but not available. "The Hendersons are bidding aggressively on the Monet," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the cocktail party chatter. "And Senator Williams wants a private word about the infrastructure bill." Marcus nodded absently, his attention drawn to a woman across the room who bore a passing resemblance to Isabella. For a moment, his heart had leapt with the impossible hope that his wife had changed her mind, that her migraine had miraculously cleared, that she had come to support him at an event that mattered to both their public image and his business interests. But it was merely a stranger, another wealthy wife with auburn hair and expensive taste, and the disappointment left him feeling more isolated than before. Marcus Blackwell. The voice belonged to Patricia Williamson, the wife of a hedge fund manager and one of Isabella's former friends from the charity circuit. Patricia's smile was bright and brittle, the kind of expression that preceded either congratulations or condolences. "I was hoping to see Isabella tonight. How is she feeling?" The question was innocent enough, but Marcus detected an undercurrent of knowing concern, as if Patricia was privy to information he lacked. "She has a migraine," he replied, offering Isabella's excuse without enthusiasm. "You know how those can be."
Patricia's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh, yes, of course. She's been getting those quite frequently lately, hasn't she? Poor thing. All that stress from her new project." The pause before project was loaded with implication, and Marcus felt his chest tighten. "What project?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Oh, I assumed you knew," Patricia said, her tone suggesting she assumed nothing of the sort. "She's been so busy with her new gallery space in Tribeca. Such an ambitious undertaking, especially working so closely with her business partner. What's his name again? Antonio something?" The name hit Marcus like a physical blow, though he managed to keep his expression neutral. Isabella hadn't mentioned a gallery space in Tribeca, hadn't spoken of any business partner, certainly hadn't mentioned anyone named Antonio. "I don't recall the name," he said carefully. "Isabella keeps her business affairs quite separate from mine." Patricia's smile sharpened, predatory and satisfied. "How wonderfully modern of you both. Well, I'm sure she'll tell you all about it when she's ready. These artistic types can be so secretive about their work, can't they? Speaking of which, I should go find my husband before he bids away our children's inheritance." She glided away, leaving Marcus standing alone with a champagne flute in his hand and a name echoing in his mind. Antonio. Something. The charity auction continued around him, voices rising and falling in the ancient rhythm of wealth displaying itself, but Marcus heard none of it. His wife had a business partner she'd never mentioned, a gallery space he'd never seen, an entire professional life that existed in complete secrecy from their marriage. Elena reappeared, her dark eyes immediately registering his distress. "Everything all right?" she asked quietly. "Fine," Marcus lied, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Just tired. It's been a long week." But Elena had worked with him long enough to recognize his tells, the slight tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed against his thigh, the distant look that meant his mind was processing information and reaching conclusions he didn't want to acknowledge. She said nothing more, but stayed close as he mechanically worked the room, shaking hands and making small talk, while part of his consciousness remained focused on a single question. Who was Antonio? The auction itself was a blur of raised paddles and escalating bids, wealthy patrons competing for the privilege of supporting worthy causes while simultaneously displaying their financial superiority. Marcus bid on and won a sculpture by a promising young artist, paying twice its estimated value without paying attention to the auctioneer's excited commentary. His mind was elsewhere, spinning through possibilities and connections, trying to piece together the fragments of his wife's hidden life. After the formal events concluded, Marcus found himself in conversation with Robert Chen, a tech entrepreneur whose company had recently gone public. They discussed market conditions and regulatory challenges, but Marcus noticed Chen's slight discomfort, the way his eyes avoided direct contact, the subtle shifting of weight that suggested nervous energy. "Actually, Marcus," Chen said finally, glancing around to ensure their conversation remained private, "I saw Isabella last week at Osteria Romana. You know the place, that little Italian restaurant in Tribeca?" Marcus nodded, though the name was unfamiliar. Isabella had always preferred more fashionable establishments in Midtown or the Upper East Side. "She was having dinner with someone," Chen continued, his words carefully chosen. "Tall, dark hair, looked like he might be in the art world. You know the type. Expensive but not ostentatious clothing, that artistic confidence. They seemed close. The word close hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Marcus forced himself to smile, to project the casual indifference of a man comfortable with his wife's professional relationships. Probably a gallery owner or curator. Isabella's been expanding her network lately. Chen nodded quickly, relieved to have discharged his uncomfortable duty. Of course. I just thought, well, you know how it is. This city is so small sometimes, even though it's enormous.
After Chen moved on to safer conversational territory, Marcus stood alone in the museum's great hall, surrounded by priceless art and the murmur of New York's elite, feeling more isolated than he had ever felt in his life. Two people now had mentioned Isabella's mysterious activities, her secret partner, her hidden gallery space. The evidence was accumulating like snow in a gathering storm, each flake insignificant by itself, but collectively creating something that would reshape the landscape entirely. Elena approached with his coat and a concerned expression. "Ready to go?" she asked softly. "Actually," Marcus said, making a decision that surprised himself, "let's take a drive. I want to see something." They rode in silence through the neon-lit canyons of Manhattan, James navigating the evening traffic with his usual skill, while Marcus stared out the window at the city he had conquered but never truly understood. The lights of restaurants and bars blurred past, each one potentially holding secrets, each doorway possibly concealing betrayals. How many of the couples visible through restaurant windows were hiding truths from each other? How many successful marriages were actually elaborate performances staged for public consumption? "Tribeca," Marcus said suddenly. "Drive through Tribeca, slowly." James adjusted their route without comment, the Bentley gliding through the trendy neighborhood where industrial buildings had been converted into luxury lofts, and street-level spaces housed cutting-edge galleries and exclusive restaurants. Marcus studied every storefront, looking for signs of Isabella's mysterious gallery, searching for clues that might explain her recent behavior. They passed Osteria Romana, the restaurant Robert Chen had mentioned, and Marcus noted its intimate atmosphere, the warm light spilling from its windows, the couples visible at candlelit tables inside. It was exactly the kind of place Isabella would choose for a private dinner, romantic and discreet, the type of establishment where wealthy people conducted affairs while their spouses attended charity auctions alone. "Stop here," Marcus said, as they passed a narrow gallery space with darkened windows. The sign read, "Meridian Contemporary," and though the space appeared closed, Marcus could see paintings hung on the walls inside, illuminated by security lighting that suggested recent activity. Elena followed his gaze to the gallery. "Do you want to get out?" she asked. Marcus considered it, imagining himself walking up to those darkened windows, peering inside like a stalker or private detective, reducing himself to the kind of desperate behavior he had always despised in others. "No," he said finally, "let's go home." But home felt less like a sanctuary than ever before. The penthouse was empty, Isabella's absence palpable in every room. Her perfume lingered faintly in the bedroom. Her clothes were scattered across the chair where she always left them. Her reading glasses sat on the nightstand next to a novel she'd been reading for months without apparent progress. These domestic artifacts felt like props in a stage set, evidence of a life being performed rather than lived. Marcus poured himself a scotch and sat in his study, surrounded by the trophies of his professional success, awards, photographs with world leaders, framed newspaper articles chronicling his rise from poverty to power. Each achievement had once felt like armor against the vulnerability he'd known as a child, protection against a world that had shown him early and often that love was conditional and security was an illusion. Now that armor felt like a cage, beautiful but imprisoning, keeping him isolated from the very connections he most desperately needed. His laptop sat open on the mahogany desk, its screen displaying stock prices and market reports from around the world. Marcus closed the financial websites and, after a moment of hesitation, typed Meridian Contemporary, Tribeca, into a search engine. The gallery's website loaded slowly, displaying images of contemporary paintings and sculptures, artist biographies, and exhibition schedules. The About page featured a photograph of the gallery's director, Antonio Mancini, a man in his early 40s with dark hair, sharp cheekbones, and the kind of casual confidence that came from a lifetime in the art world.
Marcus stared at the photograph, studying Antonio's face for clues about his character, his intentions, his relationship with Isabella. He was undeniably handsome in the way of European men who understood that true sophistication came from understatement rather than ostentation. His biography mentioned previous positions at galleries in Rome and London, exhibitions he had curated, artists whose careers he had championed. There was no mention of a wife or family, no indication of his personal life beyond his professional achievements. The rational part of Marcus's mind insisted that Isabella's relationship with Antonio could be entirely professional, that successful people in the art world often worked closely together, that collaboration required trust and intimacy that might appear suspicious to outsiders. But another part of him, the part that had learned to trust his instincts about people and situations, recognized something deeper in the careful construction of Isabella's deception. The lies were too elaborate, too consistent, too well maintained to be casual oversights. She was protecting something, and that something was almost certainly more than a business relationship. Marcus closed the laptop and walked to the bedroom, where Isabella's side of the bed remained undisturbed. Her pillow still held the indentation of her head from the previous night, and he found himself touching the silk fabric, wondering when she would return, what excuse she would offer, how long the charade would continue. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Millions of people navigating their own relationships, their own betrayals, their own desperate attempts to find meaning in a world that offered no guarantees. The clock read 12:47 a.m. when Isabella finally returned. Her heel was clicking softly against the marble foyer. Marcus listened from the bedroom as she moved through her nightly routine, keys in the bowl, purse on the console table, a brief pause that suggested she was checking her appearance in the hallway mirror. Her footsteps on the stairs were light, careful, the movement of someone trying not to wake a sleeping spouse. She slipped into the bedroom like a ghost, moving through the darkness with practiced quiet. Marcus kept his breathing steady and deep, feigning sleep while every nerve in his body was alert to her presence. He heard the soft whisper of fabric as she undressed, the quiet opening and closing of drawers, the sound of water running in the bathroom. When she finally slipped into bed beside him, the mattress barely shifted under her weight. In the darkness, Marcus caught a scent that didn't belong. Not Isabella's usual perfume, but something masculine and unfamiliar. Wine, perhaps, or cologne that had transferred from another person's clothing during an embrace. The smell was subtle, probably undetectable to anyone not searching for evidence of betrayal, but to Marcus, it was as obvious as a neon sign. Isabella's breathing gradually settled into the rhythm of sleep, but Marcus lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling and listening to the woman beside him breathe lies into the darkness. The next morning brought a confrontation that had been building for weeks. Isabella was already dressed when Marcus emerged from the shower, her hair styled in loose waves that framed her face, her makeup applied with the precision of someone who had somewhere important to be. She wore a cream-colored cashmere sweater that he'd bought her for Christmas, paired with designer jeans that hugged her curves in ways that reminded him of why he'd fallen in love with her. "Good morning," she said without looking up from her phone, her voice carrying the distant politeness of a hotel concierge. "I'll be out most of the day, gallery appointments." Marcus paused in the doorway of their walk-in closet, towel wrapped around his waist, water still dripping from his hair. "Which gallery?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Isabella's fingers stopped moving across her phone screen for just a moment, a pause so brief it might have been unnoticeable to someone not watching for it. "Several galleries," she said. "I'm looking at pieces for a potential exhibition, nothing concrete yet." The lie came so easily, so smoothly, that Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. "I ran into Patricia Williamson last night," he said, pulling on his shirt with deliberate slowness. "She mentioned you've been working with someone named Antonio on a gallery space in Tribeca." This time, the pause was longer, more obvious. Isabella set down her phone and turned to face him, her emerald eyes wide with what appeared to be surprise, but could just as easily have been calculation. "Patricia has always been a gossip," she said finally. "I can't imagine why she would say that." "So you're not working with anyone named Antonio?" "Marcus, why are you interrogating me like this? I told you I have gallery appointments today. If you don't trust me, just say so." The deflection was masterful, turning his reasonable questions into accusations of paranoia, making him the villain in a story where he was increasingly certain he was the victim. But Marcus had spent too many years in boardrooms to be manipulated by emotional tactics. "I'm not interrogating you," he said quietly. "I'm asking my wife about her work, which she's apparently been keeping secret from me." Isabella's expression shifted, and for a moment Marcus saw something vulnerable in her eyes, something that reminded him of the woman he'd married. "It's complicated," she said softly. "I wanted to have something concrete to show you before I explained everything. I didn't want to get your hopes up if it doesn't work out." The explanation was plausible, even touching in its consideration for his feelings. Marcus wanted to believe it, wanted to accept the possibility that Isabella's secrecy was motivated by love rather than deception. But the masculine cologne still lingered in his memory, along with Patricia's knowing smile and Robert Chen's uncomfortable revelation about intimate dinners in Tribeca restaurants. "What kind of exhibition?" he asked, offering her an opportunity to elaborate on her story, to provide details that might support her explanation. "Contemporary women artists," Isabella said, her confidence returning as she built upon her narrative. "Emerging voices who haven't had proper representation. It's something I've been passionate about for years, you know that." Marcus did know that. Early in their relationship, Isabella had spoken frequently about the challenges facing female artists, the institutional barriers that prevented women from achieving recognition in the art world. Her passion for the subject had been genuine and compelling, one of the qualities that had drawn him to her. Now he wondered if that passion was being channeled into work that excluded him entirely, or if it was simply being used as convenient cover for activities that had nothing to do with art. "When can I see the space?" he asked. "It's not ready yet," Isabella replied quickly. "Still under construction. Maybe in a few weeks, when there's actually something to see." Another excuse, another delay, another reason why Marcus couldn't be included in this mysterious project that was consuming increasing amounts of his wife's time and attention. The pattern was clear, even if the full truth remained hidden. Marcus was living a double life, maintaining their marriage as a public facade while investing her real emotional energy elsewhere.
Marcus finished dressing in silence, each piece of his daily armor. The expensive suit, the platinum cufflinks, the Italian leather shoes, feeling like costume pieces for a role he no longer wanted to play. The man in the mirror looked successful and confident, but Marcus knew that image was as much a lie as Isabella's explanations about gallery appointments and women's art exhibitions. "I should go," Isabella said, gathering her purse and keys with obvious relief. "I'll see you tonight." But Marcus knew she wouldn't see him tonight, just as he knew there would be another excuse, another last-minute change of plans, another apologetic note left on the kitchen counter. The dance of deception had become so routine that both participants knew the steps by heart. even if only one of them acknowledged the choreography. After Isabella left, Marcus stood alone in their bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of their shared life. Wedding photos, vacation souvenirs, gifts they'd given each other during happier times. Each object felt like an artifact from a lost civilization, beautiful but meaningless relics of something that had died without either of them having the courage to pronounce it dead. His phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Your 9 a.m. meeting has been moved to 9:30. Traffic is heavy on the FDR drive." The mundane efficiency of the message was somehow comforting, a reminder that parts of his life still functioned according to predictable rules and logical patterns. At the office, Marcus threw himself into work with desperate intensity, as if professional success could compensate for personal failure. He reviewed acquisition proposals, conducted conference calls with international partners, and made decisions that would affect thousands of employees and millions of dollars in revenue. The familiar rhythms of corporate leadership provided temporary refuge from the chaos of his domestic life. But even in the middle of high-stakes negotiations, part of his mind remained focused on Isabella and Antonio and the gallery space in Tribeca that might or might not exist. Elena noticed his distraction during the staff meeting, the way his attention wandered during budget presentations, the slight delay in his responses to direct questions. After the meeting ended and the conference room emptied, she remained behind, her expression carefully neutral. "Everything all right?" she asked, the same question she'd posed the night before, but with greater urgency. Marcus closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, suddenly exhausted by the effort required to maintain his professional composure. "No," he said simply, "everything is not all right." Elena waited patiently as Marcus gathered his thoughts, her dark eyes reflecting the kind of compassion that came from years of witnessing his struggles and victories. She had been there during his darkest professional moments, had helped him navigate corporate betrayals and hostile takeovers, had seen him at his most vulnerable and most triumphant. In many ways, she knew him better than Isabella ever had. "I think my wife is having an affair," Marcus said finally, the words feeling strange and bitter in his mouth. "I think she's been lying to me for months, maybe longer, and I don't know what to do about it." Elena's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, a sadness that suggested she had suspected this possibility long before Marcus was ready to acknowledge it. "What makes you think that?" she asked gently. Marcus told her about the restaurant sightings, the mysterious gallery space, the business partner Isabella had never mentioned, the lies that were becoming more elaborate and frequent. As he spoke, the evidence seemed to accumulate weight, each detail adding to a picture that was becoming impossible to deny. "Have you confronted her directly?" Elena asked. "This morning. She had explanations for everything, plausible explanations, but—" Marcus trailed off, struggling to articulate the intuition that trumped logic, the certainty that came from knowing someone intimately enough to recognize when they were performing rather than being authentic. "But you don't believe her?" "No, I don't believe her." Elena was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming softly against the conference table. "What do you want to do?" she asked finally.
It was a simple question with profound implications. Marcus could continue pretending, could accept Isabella's lies and maintain their marriage as a public performance while dying slowly inside. He could confront her more aggressively, demand proof of her activities, and risk destroying whatever remnants of their relationship might be salvageable. Or he could seek definitive proof of her betrayal, hire investigators and gather evidence, and arm himself for the divorce that seemed increasingly inevitable. "I want to know the truth," Marcus said. "All of it, even if it destroys everything." Elena nodded slowly, her expression grave with understanding. "The truth has a way of destroying things that were never as solid as they appeared," she said. "But it also has a way of setting people free." Outside the conference room windows, Manhattan stretched endlessly in all directions, a city built on ambition and betrayal, success and failure, love and loss. Somewhere in that vast landscape, Isabella was living her secret life, making choices that would determine the fate of their marriage. And Marcus was finally ready to stop being a passive victim of those choices, ready to reclaim some measure of control over his own destiny. The first step would be hiring a private investigator, someone discreet and professional who could provide the evidence Marcus needed to confirm his suspicions. The second step would be preparing for the possibility that everything he'd built his adult life around, his marriage, his public image, his belief in love and commitment, was about to crumble like a house built on sand. But for the first time in months, Marcus felt something approaching relief. The uncertainty was killing him slowly, eating away at his confidence and self-respect like acid. Whatever the truth revealed, it had to be better than living in limbo, pretending everything was fine, while knowing at his heart that nothing was fine at all. The war for his marriage was about to begin, and Marcus Blackwell had never lost a war that mattered to him. But this time, victory might look like defeat, and defeat might be the only path to salvation. 3 days later, Marcus sat across from Detective Sarah Chen in a small cafe in the East Village, far from the Manhattan power circles where his face was instantly recognizable. Sarah had been recommended by his attorney, a former NYPD detective who now worked as a private investigator specializing in matrimonial cases. She was in her 40s with prematurely gray hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested years of observing humanity at its worst. "I want to be clear about what we're discussing," Sarah said, her voice low and professional. "You're hiring me to conduct surveillance on your wife to determine if she's engaged in an extramarital affair. Is that correct?" The words sounded harsh and sordid when spoken aloud, reducing his marriage to the kind of tawdry drama he'd always associated with tabloid headlines and divorce court television shows. "Yes," Marcus said simply. Sarah opened a manila folder and pulled out a standard contract. "My rate is $500 per day plus expenses. I'll need photographs of your wife, her schedule if you have it, and any specific locations or individuals you want me to focus on. I typically provide daily reports with photographs and video when possible." Marcus handed her a recent photograph of Isabella, taken at a charity gala, her emerald eyes bright with laughter, her auburn hair styled in elegant waves. Looking at the image, he felt a sharp pang of loss for the woman he had fallen in love with, the passionate artist who had challenged his worldview and made him feel like more than just a sum of money and ambition.
"The gallery is called Meridian Contemporary," Marcus said, providing the address in Tribeca. "The owner is Antonio Mancini. I believe they've been working together, though my wife has never mentioned him to me." Sarah made notes in her precise handwriting, asking questions about Isabella's routine, her friends, the restaurants and shops she frequented. Each detail felt like a betrayal, as if Marcus was providing ammunition for an attack on his own marriage. But the alternative, continuing to live in uncertainty and denial, had become unbearable. "One more thing," Sarah said as they prepared to conclude their meeting. "Are you prepared for the possibility that your suspicions are correct? Infidelity cases have a way of revealing truths that people aren't ready to handle. Once you know something definitively, you can't unknow it." Marcus thought about the question as he walked back to his office, his steps echoing through the narrow streets of the East Village. The neighborhood felt like a different world from the corporate towers of Midtown, more authentic somehow, populated by artists and students and people whose lives weren't measured primarily in dollars and stock options. He wondered if this was the kind of place Isabella felt more comfortable now, among people who valued creativity and passion over financial success. That evening, Isabella was home when he arrived, a rare occurrence that felt almost surreal. She stood in their kitchen preparing dinner, wearing an apron over her designer clothes, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail that made her look younger and more approachable. For a moment, Marcus allowed himself to hope that this was a sign that whatever crisis had been building in their marriage was resolving itself naturally. "I thought we could eat together tonight,"
Isabella said, not looking up from the cutting board where she was slicing vegetables with careful precision. It feels like we haven't had a real conversation in weeks. The irony was not lost on Marcus, Isabella expressing concern about their lack of communication while maintaining an elaborate deception about her daily activities. But he played along, opening a bottle of wine and setting the table with the fine china they rarely used anymore. Dinner was a careful dance of small talk and avoided subjects, both of them working to maintain the illusion of normalcy while navigating around the landmines of their actual feelings. Isabella talked about a museum exhibition she had visited, her opinions on contemporary art trends, her thoughts on supporting emerging artists. Marcus found himself studying her face as she spoke, looking for signs of deception, analyzing her word choices for hidden meanings. "You seem distracted," Isabella observed, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. "Is everything all right at work?" The question was perfectly reasonable, the kind of inquiry any wife might make about her husband's professional life. But coming from Isabella, it felt like deflection, an attempt to redirect attention away from her own activities and towards safer territory. "Work is fine," Marcus said. "Actually, work is excellent. We closed the Morrison deal ahead of schedule, and the quarterly numbers exceeded projections by 12%. Isabella smiled and nodded, but Marcus could see that the information didn't really register with her. There had been a time when his professional victories mattered to her, when she celebrated his successes as genuinely as if they were her own. Now, his achievements seemed to bounce off her like raindrops on glass, acknowledged but not absorbed. "What about your gallery project?" Marcus asked, watching her reaction carefully. "How is that progressing?" Isabella's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on her wine glass. "Slowly," she said. "These things take time. There are permits to obtain, contractors to coordinate, artists to court. It's more complicated than I initially anticipated."
"That's sweet of you," Isabella said, her tone suggesting anything but sweetness. "But I want to do this myself. It's important to me that this project succeeds or fails based on my own efforts, not because of your influence or money." The rejection stung, not because Marcus particularly wanted to be involved in Isabella's professional endeavors, but because it represented another wall between them, another area of her life where he was explicitly unwelcome. Their marriage had become a series of parallel lives that occasionally intersected for public appearances or domestic logistics, but never truly merged into the partnership he'd once believed they shared. After dinner, they sat in the living room with coffee and brandy, the Manhattan skyline twinkling outside their floor-to-ceiling windows. Isabella curled into her corner of the sofa with a book, her legs tucked beneath her in a pose that was both elegant and defensive. Marcus pretended to review financial reports on his tablet while actually observing his wife, noting the way she turned pages without appearing to read, the way her eyes occasionally drifted to her phone when she thought he wasn't looking. At 10:30, Isabella yawned elaborately and announced her intention to go to bed early. "I have an early appointment tomorrow," she explained, kissing Marcus's forehead with the kind of perfunctory affection typically reserved for distant relatives. "Don't stay up too late with those reports." Marcus waited until he heard the bedroom door close before pulling out his phone and texting Sarah Chen. Subject: will likely be active tomorrow morning. Early appointment mentioned, but no specifics provided. The message felt like crossing a line he could never uncross, officially beginning surveillance on the woman he'd promised to love and honor until death parted them. Sleep was elusive that night, his mind churning through possibilities and scenarios, each one more painful than the last. He imagined Isabella in Antonio's arms, whispering words of love that she no longer spoke to her husband. He pictured them planning a future together that didn't include Marcus, laughing about the wealthy fool who paid for her lifestyle while she gave her heart to someone else. The images were torture, but he couldn't stop his imagination from creating increasingly detailed scenes of betrayal. The next morning brought the first report from Sarah Chen,
delivered via encrypted email to an account Marcus had created specifically for this purpose. The photographs were professional quality, but devastating in their clarity. Isabella entering Meridian Contemporary at 9:15 a.m., embracing Antonio Mancini in the gallery's window where anyone walking by could see them, their bodies pressed together in a way that suggested far more than professional collaboration. The embrace lasted longer than any business greeting, Isabella's hand resting on Antonio's chest in a gesture of intimate familiarity. Their faces were turned toward each other with expressions of joy and affection that Marcus recognized from the early days of their own relationship, when seeing each other had been a source of genuine happiness rather than a domestic obligation. The second photograph showed them walking together through Tribeca, Isabella's arm linked through Antonio's, both of them animated in conversation. They looked like lovers, like people discovering each other, like two individuals who had found something precious and rare in a world that offered few guarantees about human connection. The third photograph was taken through the restaurant window of Osteria Romana, the same establishment Robert Chen had mentioned. Isabella and Antonio sat at a corner table, leaning toward each other across the small space between them, Antonio's hand covering Isabella's on the white tablecloth. The lighting was romantic, the setting intimate, their body language unmistakably that of two people in love. Marcus closed the laptop and walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass as he had done so many nights recently. The city spread below him like a vast game board, millions of people pursuing their own complex strategies for happiness and success. Somewhere down there, his wife was living her authentic life with a man who made her smile the way she used to smile at Marcus. And he was standing alone in a penthouse that suddenly felt more like a prison than a palace. His phone rang, jolting him from his brooding. Elena's voice was professionally neutral. "Your 11 a.m. is here early. Should I have them wait, or would you prefer to start the meeting now?"
"Give me 5 minutes," Marcus said, his voice sounding strange and hollow to his own ears. "And Elena, clear my calendar for this afternoon. I need to take care of some personal business." The confrontation Marcus had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure came on a Thursday evening in November, as the first snow of the season began to dust the city in the thin layer of white that made everything look temporarily pure and new. Isabella had texted another excuse about working late at the gallery, but Sarah Chen's surveillance photos showed her sharing an intimate dinner with Antonio at a small French bistro in the village, their faces illuminated by candlelight as they fed each other dessert with the casual intimacy of established lovers. Marcus sat in his study with the photographs spread across his mahogany desk like evidence in a criminal trial, each image a piece of a puzzle that painted a picture he no longer had any desire to deny. There were dozens of them now, accumulated over 2 weeks of professional surveillance. Isabella and Antonio walking hand in hand through Washington Square Park, embracing outside his Soho apartment building, sharing passionate kisses in the doorway of Meridian Contemporary after hours. The visual documentation of his wife's affair was comprehensive and unambiguous, leaving no room for innocent explanations or willful ignorance. When Isabella's key turned in the lock at 11:45 p.m., Marcus was waiting in the living room with a glass of scotch and a manila envelope containing the photographs. She entered with the quiet movements of someone trying not to wake a sleeping spouse, her heels clicking softly against the marble foyer as she set down her purse and removed her coat. In the dim lighting, she looked beautiful and guilty, her hair slightly mussed, her lipstick worn away, her clothes bearing the subtle signs of intimate contact with another person. "You're up late," Marcus said, his voice sounding strange and hollow to his own ears. "I was waiting for you. We need to talk." Isabella's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her shoulders straightening as if preparing for battle. "It's very late, Marcus. Can't this wait until morning?" "No, it can't wait." Marcus stood and walked to the windows, his back to Isabella, as he gathered the courage to destroy his marriage with the truth. Outside, the snow was falling more heavily now, transforming the city into something magical and ethereal, a winter wonderland that seemed to mock the ugliness of what was about to unfold in their living room.
I know about Antonio, he said finally, his words falling into the silence like stones into still water. The pause that followed stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. When Isabella finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled, professionally neutral. I don't know what you think you know, but I know everything. Marcus turned to face her, the manila envelope in his hands. I know about the gallery that doesn't exist. I know about the dinners at Osteria Romana and the bistro in the village. I know about his apartment in Soho and the way you kiss him goodbye every morning after spending the night there. Isabella's face went through a series of rapid changes: surprise, calculation, defiance, and finally something that might have been relief. The mask she'd been wearing for months finally slipped, revealing the woman underneath who was tired of lying, tired of pretending, tired of maintaining a marriage that had become a performance for both of them. How long have you known? She asked, sinking into the chair across from him, with the boneless collapse of someone whose strength had suddenly deserted her. I've suspected for months. I've known for certain for 2 weeks. Marcus opened the envelope and spread the photographs across the coffee table between them, a gallery of betrayal documented in high-resolution color. Isabella looked at the images without flinching, her emerald eyes moving from picture to picture with something that looked almost like pride. These photographs showed her at her most authentic, her most alive, her most genuinely happy in ways that Marcus realized he hadn't seen in years. Why? The question came out more wounded than angry, though Marcus felt both emotions in equal measure. Why not just ask for a divorce? Why the elaborate deception, the lies, the months of making me feel like I was losing my mind? Isabella was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of one photograph that showed her laughing at something Antonio had said. Because I was afraid, she said finally, her voice carrying a note of emotion that might have been fear or regret. Afraid of hurting you, afraid of the public scandal, afraid of losing the security and comfort that comes with being your wife, afraid of starting over at 35 with nothing but my own uncertain prospects.
Do you love him? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer from the photographs, from the way Isabella's entire demeanor changed when she looked at images of herself with Antonio. Yes. The word was simple and devastating. I love him in ways I'm not sure I ever loved you. I love his passion for art, his intensity, his willingness to risk everything for something he believes in. I love the way he sees me, not as an accessory to your success, but as an artist in my own right, with something valuable to contribute to the world. Each word was a knife thrust, precisely aimed and expertly delivered. Marcus felt something inside him breaking, not just his heart, but his entire understanding of his marriage, his life, his identity as a husband and partner. The woman sitting across from him was a stranger, someone who had been hiding behind the familiar face of his wife for months, or perhaps years. "Were you ever happy with me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Was any of it real?" Isabella's expression softened, and for a moment she looked like the woman he'd married, vulnerable and genuine and capable of real tenderness. "It was real in the beginning," she said gently. "I loved your ambition, your determination to succeed despite everything you'd overcome. I loved the way you treated me like a queen, the way you wanted to give me everything I'd ever dreamed of. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being a person and became a possession, another beautiful thing in your collection of beautiful things." The accusation hit home because it contained enough truth to hurt. Marcus had lavished Isabella with gifts and experiences, had treated her like a princess in a fairy tale, but had he ever truly seen her as an equal partner? Had he fallen in love with Isabella the person, or Isabella the idea, the beautiful, cultured woman who could complement his public image and validate his transformation from street kid to billionaire? "I tried to tell you," Isabella continued, her voice gaining strength.
I tried to talk to you about feeling isolated, about missing my art, about wanting to contribute something meaningful to the world beyond just being your wife. But you always had solutions that involved spending money or using your influence, never solutions that actually listening to what I was trying to say. Marcus remembered those conversations differently, recalled himself as supportive and encouraging, ready to fund any project or open any door that might make Isabella happy. But perhaps that had been part of the problem, his assumption that happiness could be purchased, that love could be expressed through grand gestures and expensive gifts rather than genuine understanding and emotional intimacy. When did it start? With Antonio. 6 months ago. I met him at a gallery opening in Chelsea. He was passionate about showcasing emerging female artists, actually creating opportunities for women who had been overlooked by the established art world. We started talking about art, about life, about dreams and disappointments. He listened to me, Marcus, really listened, not just waited for his turn to speak or thought about how to solve my problems with money. The timeline made sense, aligning with the period when Isabella had become more distant, more secretive, more critical of their lifestyle and the superficiality of their social circle. Marcus realized that he had been watching his marriage disintegrate in real time, too focused on business success to recognize the signs of emotional abandonment happening in his own home. The gallery in Tribeca is real. Antonio and I are partners, both professionally and personally. We're opening in January with an exhibition of contemporary women artists, many of whom have never had solo shows before. It's everything I've wanted to do for years, the kind of work that feels meaningful and important. The irony was sharp. Isabella had found her professional passion and personal fulfillment simultaneously, but neither included the husband who would have gladly supported both if he had been given the opportunity. Marcus felt a wave of self-pity followed immediately by anger at his own blindness. How had he failed to see that his wife was withering inside their marriage? How had he missed the signs that she needed more than luxury and comfort to feel fulfilled? "What happens now?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer.
"I want a divorce," Isabella said simply. "I want to end this marriage before we destroy each other completely. Antonio and I want to build something together, something real and honest and passionate. I can't do that while living this lie with you." The words should have surprised him, but Marcus realized he felt mostly relief. The uncertainty was finally over, the truth was on the table, and he could stop pretending to be happy in a marriage that had been dead for months. The pain was enormous, but it was clean pain, the kind that came from surgery rather than infection. "I'll have my attorney contact yours," Marcus said, his voice regaining some of his professional steadiness. "We can work out the details privately, without unnecessary publicity or ugliness." Isabella nodded, tears forming in her emerald eyes for the first time since the conversation began. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I'm sorry for the lies, for the deception, for hurting you this way. You deserve better than what I've given you." The apology was genuine, but insufficient, like trying to bandage a severed limb with a small adhesive strip. Marcus stood and walked to the window again, watching the snow fall on the city below. Somewhere out there, millions of people were sleeping peacefully beside partners who loved them authentically, completely, without reservation or deception. He envied them their simple happiness, their uncomplicated intimacy, their freedom from the kind of elaborate betrayal that wealth and status seemed to attract. "I'll sleep in the guest room tonight," Isabella said, standing to leave. "I'll start looking for an apartment tomorrow." "No," Marcus said, without turning around. "This is your home until the divorce is final. I'll stay at the corporate apartment." It was a gesture of generosity, or perhaps simply a desire to escape the scene of his humiliation as quickly as possible. Either way, it felt like the right thing to do, the mature response of a man who still possessed some dignity, despite having been thoroughly betrayed by the woman he'd loved. After Isabella left the room, Marcus stood alone in the living room where they'd entertained heads of state and captains of industry, where they'd celebrated anniversaries and holidays, where they'd played out the elaborate performance of their marriage for friends and family who would soon learn that it had all been an illusion. The photographs of Isabella and Antonio remained scattered across the coffee table, evidence of a love affair that had blossomed while his own marriage withered. Marcus gathered the pictures and placed them back in the manila envelope, sealing away the visual proof of his failure as a husband. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and accountants, negotiations and settlements, the complex machinery of divorce that would dismantle everything they'd built together over 5 years of marriage. But tonight, for the first time in months, Marcus felt something approaching peace. The lies were over, the truth was known, and he could begin the painful but necessary process of rebuilding his life on a foundation of honesty rather than illusion. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the city in pristine white, offering the promise of new beginnings and fresh starts. Marcus Blackwell, billionaire and newly minted cuckold, stood at his window and wondered what kind of man he would become now that he was free to discover himself, without the weight of a failed marriage dragging him down. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same corner office where his world had first begun to unravel. The divorce was finalized, Isabella had married Antonio in a small ceremony in Tuscany, and Meridian Contemporary had opened to critical acclaim. The financial settlement had been substantial but manageable, money he barely noticed losing.
What surprised Marcus most was the lightness he felt. The penthouse had been sold. He now lived in a smaller apartment overlooking the Hudson River. The corporate apartment had become his primary residence, and he discovered he preferred its simplicity to the marble mausoleum he'd shared with Isabella. Elena knocked and entered with his afternoon coffee. "The Chen acquisition is complete," she said, then paused. "You seem different lately, happier." Marcus smiled, genuinely smiled, for the first time in months. "I think I'm learning the difference between being successful and being fulfilled." Through his window, he watched couples walking along the waterfront below, their lives probably simpler but undoubtedly more authentic than his had been. The boy who'd slept in subway stations was still there inside the Billionaire, but now he was free to remember what actually mattered. Not what you owned, but who genuinely loved you.